What can the wisest man teach us about work, money, death, and life? Let's find out. I said in my heart, "Come, I will test you with pleasure, enjoy yourself." But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, "It is mad," and of pleasure, "What use is it?" I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine. My heart was guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water, forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the children of man. So I became great, surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. That was an excerpt from the book of Ecclesiastes from the Old Testament. The name Ecclesiastes comes from the Latin Vulgate, Liber Ecclesiastes, a translation of the Hebrew word kohelet, which is understood to be referring to a speaker or preacher. So what is Ecclesiastes about? Because of the way Ecclesiastes is written, there isn't a proper way to understand it. There is no orthodox way, there is no heterodox way. Besides the fact that the preacher concludes everything is vanity, and so he calls on those whom he's talking to fear God and to live according to wisdom. The interesting thing in the book of Ecclesiastes is that vanity, that word, appears 38 times, right? And this accounts for more than half of its total usage within the Old Testament. And the word vanity comes from the Hebrew word hebel, which means vapor, and so it makes it very difficult to translate this. And the best that we got so far is vanity. If you think of vapor as something that's fleeting, ephemeral, right? That's elusive and something you can't hold. That is what the book of Ecclesiastes is trying to impart. That everything is like vapor. It is fleeting. Life is elusive. It is ephemeral. It is very hard to hold on to. The book opens with vanity of vanities. All is vanity. And also closes with vanities of all vanities. All is vanity. On Solomon's journey to try to figure it all out, he is left with more questions than answers, and he ends up with vanity of vanities, all is vanity. The book is traditionally considered to be written by King Solomon, since the preacher or the teacher says he's the son of David, king of Jerusalem, someone who's wise and someone who's extremely successful. And so traditionally, and it is said that King Solomon is the author. However, modern scholars think otherwise. We are going to assume that it's King Solomon, so I'm just going to refer to the preacher as King Solomon. King Solomon finds that the work that he does is both satisfying, but it's also aggravating and burdensome. And this is something that we're going to touch on. But this paradoxical expression of like something that's satisfying and also aggravating is a common theme throughout this book. At times, King Solomon will say, wisdom is useful. It helps those who have it live longer. But at the same time, he'll go on and say, wisdom is foolishness. There's no difference between being wise and being a fool. So there is a very strong presence of paradox within this book. A quick note here is King Solomon within the Bible is considered to be the wisest man. When he's young, he has a vision, and in this vision, he meets God, and God says, "What is it that you want?" And Solomon says, "I want wisdom." And as a result of him saying that he wants wisdom, not wealth or fame or power, God gives him wisdom plus wealth, fame, and power. So Solomon, as he becomes king, uses wisdom to create a great kingdom And during his time as a king, he obviously has a purpose. Purpose is to rule as best as possible with justice, with mercy. And there are, stories of this within the Old Testament of how he does this. And I've always been fascinated with Ecclesiastes. And it's because within Ecclesiastes, you have somebody who is considered the wisest man, considered at one point the wealthiest man, considered somebody who was the most powerful. But clearly, he was missing one thing, and that was meaning. And there are people who will say, yeah, this book is not about meaning, it's about purpose. I disagree here. Because Solomon had purpose. He was the king. And as a king, you have a purpose to rule well, to rule morally right, to do your utmost in the way you treat other people and in the work that you do. So he obviously had purpose, but he didn't have meaning. And again, this idea that meaning is not important, as some have said, misses the point. Anyone who says meaning is not important is so far removed from the reality of life, the struggles, the suffering, that you must wonder, are they saying this simply to be an outsider, to look like they're not following the pack? Because when you look at life as is right now, even back then, reading Ecclesiastes, you see a man who is struggling to find meaning in what he does, in his work, in the money that he has, in the fame that he has, in the power that he has, in the amount of women that he has, in the amount of children that he has. He still does not have meaning. He also didn't find meaning in his worship of God. And if you remember the Viktor Frankl episode, right? Viktor Frankl says, a man who has a will to meaning can live through any amount of struggle, any amount of suffering. The book and the person that most closely aligns to Solomon and Ecclesiastes is Leo Tolstoy. That was the second episode, right? For Tolstoy, he had everything. He had the women, he had the fame, he had the success, he had the land, the house. But in all of this, he was missing meaning. And that drove him close to suicide. He never committed suicide, but it got him so close that he even stopped hunting because he was afraid that he would commit suicide. And Tolstoy and King Solomon are living centuries apart, and yet they both have the same struggle. And both reach a different conclusion, but very similar. And there is this one quote from Ecclesiastes that summarizes the struggle that Tolstoy has and also the struggle that Solomon is going through. And Solomon writes, if a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with life's good things, and he also has no burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. For it, being the stillborn child, comes in vanity and goes in darkness, and in darkness its name is covered. Moreover, it has not seen the sun or known anything, yet it finds rest rather than he. Even though he should live 1,000 years twice over, it enjoy no good. Do not all go to the one place. Solomon here is saying, what profits a man if he gains everything, but he does not find peace? He does not find the satisfaction to enjoy the pleasures of life, to be able to enjoy the fruits of his hard work. And he's writing this as somebody who's unable to enjoy it. Because if you remember from the opening in chapter 2, he says, and whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil. And this was my reward for all my toil. And he ends that verse with, behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. Even though he gave himself everything that his heart and his mind desired, yet in all of it, he did not find peace. He could not enjoy it because he knew that the reality of it all was he was going to die and everything was ephemeral. Everything was vapor. The pleasure that he experienced, the hours were all like vapor. We're all fleeting. Any pleasure is going to be fleeting. It might be fantastic in that moment, but it is gone. It is elusive. And the warning is you can become addicted to these things. Addicted to trying to quench that yearning to have a lasting pleasure, to have this lasting sense of satisfaction. But Solomon's point is it doesn't exist. Everything is vanity. All is vanity. And it is like chasing after the wind. It is all vapor and it's all going to disappear before your eyes. And this is why he says, if a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, right? Even if he were to live 1,000 years twice over, yet enjoys none of the good, and his soul is not satisfied with life's good things, and all of it is meaningless. All of it is useless. And he goes further and says, a stillborn child is better than this man who lives 1,000 years, has all the riches, has all the wealth, but cannot enjoy it. For the stillborn child comes in vanity and goes into darkness, and in darkness its name is covered. Moreover, it has not seen the sun or known anything, yet it finds rest rather than the man who has everything. And with Ecclesiastes, there are two very distinct moments in my life. One is reading Ecclesiastes as a young man, as somebody who hasn't experienced much life, somebody who hasn't suffered, somebody who has not experienced pain. And then the next one is somebody who has suffered. And the first time I reread it was quite a few years ago after I lost my son. That verse stood out to me. That verse was painful. But in that pain, you realize that Solomon is not wrong in saying that the stillborn child is better off than the man who has it all but does not have peace. Because with the stillborn child, and with any child that you lose, the only thing that the child knows is the love that he had from his mother and his father, whether in the womb or outside of the womb. And that is the most beautiful thing and the most precious thing that any human being can experience, is the fullness of love. Whereas this man that Solomon is talking about, which is himself, he had it all. Anything that his eyes desired, he had. But he did not have peace. And that's why he says, even though he should live 1,000 years twice over, yet enjoy no good, what is the point of it all? Then we all end up dying. Then we all end up being forgotten. So he goes on to say, there is great evil that I have seen under the sun, and it lies heavy on mankind. A man to whom God gives wealth, possessions, and honor, so that he lacks nothing of all that he desires. Yet God does not give him power to enjoy them, but a stranger enjoys them. And Solomon later on says, what is the point of me having done all this hard work to gather up all this wealth, to gain all this power, but then for my children, who does not even respect, does not even do any hard work, why is it that they get to enjoy the labors of my hard work? And this more than annoys him, this angers him, and this makes him say that it is a great evil for a man to get everything that he wants, everything that he envisions he gets, but God does not give him the power to enjoy them. That is the greatest pain. And in that situation, for Solomon, it is better to be a stillborn child than to be this man. Solomon goes on to say, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. And then says again, all the toil of a man is for his mouth, yet his appetite is not satisfied. We're talking about a book here that was written around 900 BC. And the man writing it is saying, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money. He who loves wealth will not be satisfied with wealth. This is all vanity. And all the toil of a man is for his mouth, yet his appetite, his stomach, is never satisfied. And the reason none of these things satisfy you, it's not just money, it's not just wealth. The reason these material things don't satisfy you is because they're all fleeting. They're all vapor. They will not last. Because you come empty, naked into this world, that is exactly how you're going to leave. And which is why Solomon later on says, as he came from his mother's womb, he shall go again naked as he came, and shall take nothing for his toil that he may carry away in his hand. In our modern day, it's extremely easy to distract yourself from the reality that death is simply around the corner, that you could die any moment. But many would rather never face their mortality because it's too scary. It's too terrifying to imagine a reality where you do not exist. To imagine a reality where your family, your friends go on living without you. Say most people don't want to die. That is a good thing. Because life is precious. Life is to be experienced in its fullness. But to experience the fullness of life, you have to understand that there is a ticking clock on your life. Because once you understand that, once you can foresee it, once you confront your death, once you confront this mortality before you, only then can you fully appreciate the small things in life. Only then can you fully appreciate the sweetness of life. Though this whole thing is ephemeral, this whole thing is fleeting. It's like mist. You can never grab onto mist. You can never hold it. You can at least enjoy it. And I think in the last episode we mentioned how you have to be willing to step into the river of life that is constantly changing, to fully allow life to flow through you instead of trying to hold on to it. And this is the realization that Solomon has. He goes on to say, because all is vanity, everything that we do, this toil, it's all meaningless, it's all vanity. And so what we must do is enjoy life. But returning to Solomon's understanding of work and money, he says, sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. You tend to think that an empty stomach is not what lets you sleep because you're hungry. But in this case, Solomon says, sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, because the laborer has done his work, has done his utmost work in what he does. Right? He is not worried about death. He is not worried about whether his wealth is going to be stolen, whether his status is going to be tarnished. But for the rich man, even though his stomach is full, even though he sleeps on the most comfortable bed, even though everything in his house is AI controlled, he does not have good sleep because he does not have peace. His mind is continuously troubled by all the wealth and power that he has gained. And for that reason, he does not have peace. And the obvious truth here is that not everybody who's successful is wise, but everybody who is wise is successful. And that is because a wise man knows when is enough. Wise because he understands himself, because he knows himself. He knows what it is that he wants. He knows what it is that gives him satisfaction, that gives him joy, that gives him peace. And he's able to understand that if he does not control his passions, control his desires, and let them roam free, no matter how much he has, it will never be enough for him, and he will never be at peace. Whereas not all successful persons are wise simply because wisdom is not about how much money you have, how successful your business is, how successful you are as a person. On that scale, if that was the measurement for wisdom, you would think that Confucius was not wise. You would think that Jesus was not wise. You would think that the Buddha was not wise. Why? Because the Buddha gave everything away. He gave his whole kingdom away to become the Buddha, to become enlightenment. You would think that Confucius is not wise because he was not successful in his political career, in his career even as a philosopher inside of his own province. And that's why he had to become a traveling philosopher. You would think that Jesus was not successful in his lifetime because he died and was murdered, and he had only 12 disciples at the end of it all. But we know this is not true. We know that these people were wise and ultimately were successful. You take those three men that I mentioned, Jesus, Buddha, Confucius, as an example. Their teachings outlasted the powerful people at their time. Their teachings outlasted the wealthiest people in their time. Each of them started a new religion. And all three of these religions, Christianity, Buddhism, Taoism, will last for another 500,000 more years. And one reason for that is wisdom outlasts wealth. This is why we're reading Ecclesiastes. We're not reading about all the things that King Solomon did. Instead, we're reading about King Solomon, about all the things and why those things that he did were not good, why those things that he did not give him satisfaction, did not bring him peace. And that's why he goes on to say, at the end, enjoy the fruits of your labor. And then he also writes the book of Proverbs. Again, traditionally accepted that he wrote the book of Proverbs, which is another episode that we've done. So he goes on to say, all his days he eats in darkness, in much vexation and sickness and anger. And Solomon is writing this as the most powerful man, as the wealthiest man in his time. And he's in one sense talking about himself. Understand that. He's talking about how he does not sleep even though his stomach is full. He's talking about how he eats in darkness even though he has all the light in the world, even though he has all the concubines in the world, even though he has all the fruits, all the singers and musicians, the best of the best. but in darkness he eats, in much vexation and sickness and anger. And so he says, and what does the poor man have who knows how to conduct himself before the living? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite. This is also vanity and a striving after the wind. Remember in the excerpt, King Solomon says, whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure. But then in this particular verse, he says, better is the sight of the eyes of the poor than the wandering of the appetite. Because all this is vanity. An unquenching appetite will keep you hungry forever. And following this, Solomon says, better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and a striving after wind. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the bosoms of the fools. And the Dalai Lama perfectly captures what Solomon is getting at in terms of toiling and striving after the wind, never being satisfied with what he has, and as a result not having the peace. And so the Dalai Lama says, man, because he sacrifices his health in order to make money, then he sacrifices money to recuperate his health, and then he's so anxious about the future that he does not enjoy the present. The result being that he does not live in the present or the future. He lives as if he's never going to die, and then dies having never really lived. The Dalai Lama's point is that we sacrifice oftentimes our health to get the money, but then once you get the money, you realize that health is more important, because when you're sick, you don't think about how much money you have. The only thing you want is to get better. And so then you sacrifice your money to recuperate your health. But then as you recuperate your health, you realize you're getting older, and so you become anxious about the future. You become anxious about the next thing that might happen to you. You want to preserve your wealth. You want to preserve your status. And so you're unable to enjoy the present moment. And what ends up happening is that you neither live in the present moment, but you're also not living the future, because that's an impossibility. And then, as a result, you pretend that you're never going to die. You pretend, as many people do, live as if you will never die. And then all of a sudden, you die, having never really lived in the present. Because in all your time, your mind was caught up in the future or in the past, such that the person experiencing the present moment was never you, was always somebody from the past or somebody who wanted to be in the future. And as I mentioned earlier, this book is full of paradoxes. So one example of this is, we just talked about how work and money is just vanity. There's nothing meaningful behind it, because all of it's going to go. But then Solomon goes on to say, bread is made for laughter, and wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. And so it makes you wonder, okay, bread is made for laughter, which is good. Wine gladdens life, which is also good. And money answers everything. So does that mean that we should go after money since it answers everything? But obviously Solomon goes on to say, no, you shouldn't go after money, because you'll never be satisfied with it and you'll never have peace. But this is the sort of paradox that we're talking about. So be warned, if when you read this, Solomon will throw random curveballs like this every now and then. But he's also not wrong in saying that wine gladdens life and money answers everything. With money, you can do lots and lots of things. You can buy things. You can do things that normally you wouldn't be able to do without money. And so the reality is, money, in one sense, answers everything. Everything that's material, money can get you. But everything that's immaterial, like peace, love, those things, as Solomon realizes, those things can never be got from money. So then he goes on to say, what does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Meaning, you think you're doing something important by the work that you're doing. But he says, everything that you're doing is vanity. That you're just simply toiling under the sun, because after you die, somebody else is going to replace you. This is the case for most people who do the work that they do. You are very replaceable. And so he says, a generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. He's saying the mountains that you see, the sea that you swim in, that's going to be here generations after you've gone. Long after your name has been forgotten, these things will remain the same. Hence, he goes on to say, I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and is striving after wind. He's gone and done all the things. He's gone and gone all the women, all the concubines, eaten the best food, ridden the best horses, lived in the most luxurious, comfortable homes, built the largest homes. And yet, here Solomon says, and behold, all is vanity and is striving after the wind. Then he says something interesting. I saw that all toil and all skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This is also vanity and a striving after wind. He's getting to the core motivation of why so many people toil and so many people put effort into the work that they do. Because he says it comes from his envy of his neighbor. Meaning, humans spend more time doing the work that they're doing because they want to impress other people. And he's giving the warning that you should not do the work that you're doing and acquire the skills that you're doing simply for the sake of impressing your neighbor, because this is all vanity. And you also don't want to use the money that you have, the wealth that you have, the power that you have to impress other people, or you don't want to get more of it simply out of envy, right? You don't want to wear a Loro Piani because you see that your neighbor is wearing a Brunello Cucinelli. His point is, this is all vanity. This is all striving after the wind. Because at the end of it, all this material goods that you have, these things that are impressive, they're all going to go. You can never take them with you when you die. To earth you will return. And in death, everybody is made equal. And that is a point that Solomon makes later on, which we'll get into. So if work is toil and money doesn't get you the peace that you want, what is it that you should do? Solomon says, I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were before me. And my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also is but a striving after wind. Every time I read this, I have this thought. Does Solomon actually have wisdom? Because if he truly had wisdom, why did he have to go out and experience all these things? If you have wisdom, as we've talked about before in other episodes, you know yourself and you know when it's enough for you. But clearly, Solomon did not have that. Solomon went and got everything that his mind, his heart, his eyes desired, right? And he says, I acquired great wisdom, applied my heart to know wisdom, to know madness and folly. And perhaps it's his application in trying to know madness and folly that made him stumble and made him go down this rabbit hole, to which he goes, and I perceive that all is vanity and striving after the wind. For he goes on to say, what advantage has the wise man over the fool? Again, one of those paradoxical things that he says, these curveballs that he throws at you. He says the wise man dies just as the foolish man dies. So what advantage does a wise man have over the foolish man? Yet even in this struggle, you do see that he has wisdom, because he goes, I am going to go after wisdom. And he sees all these things that wisdom allows him to do, allows him to understand. So he says, I turn to consider wisdom and madness and folly, for what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more to gain in light than in darkness. And that is his realization, that there is more to gain in wisdom than in folly. That it is better to be in the light than in the darkness. When I was young, I was surrounded by drug addicts and people with HIV and AIDS, because these were the people that my parents were looking after and helping. And as a result of it, I always used to think, do I have to become a drug addict to understand that being a drug addict is bad for you? Because these people would tell me that they got HIV from sharing needles, from being, hooked on heroin, and would always say, IJ, don't do heroin. Not that I ever wanted to do heroin, but I would think to myself, is the only way of knowing and understanding that one way is bad for you is for yourself to go down to that path, to experience it in the fullness, and then for you to climb back out of it. And obviously, you don't have to walk down the path of being a drug addict to understand that being a drug addict is not good for you. But in the case of Solomon, it is similar. He's asking himself, I have applied my heart to wisdom, but is that enough? Should I also apply my heart to madness and folly? And it seems like that is precisely what he does. But he ends up concluding that there is more to gain in wisdom than in folly. There's more to gain in light than in darkness. So Solomon goes on to say, I say that wisdom is better than might, though the poor man's wisdom is despised and his words are not heard. Meaning, even if you are poor but you have wisdom, it is better to have that than to have power. And the reason he says this, in his own words, wisdom gives strength to the wise man more than 10 rulers who are in a city. Because through your wisdom, you will have conviction. And through your conviction, you will be able to stand firm in what you believe without having to kowtow, to bend your knees, and to allow injustice to happen before you. Whereas if you have strength without wisdom, you simply become destructive, both to yourself and to those around you. Solomon goes on to ask, who is like the wise, and who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. And then again, the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. And the words of the wise heard in quiet are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. This is similar to what he says in the book of Proverbs, and he says things like this. Dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench, so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. Or if the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength, but wisdom helps one succeed. Solomon's point in all of this is that wisdom is crucially important in living a life that is filled not only with peace, but also a life of honor. And wisdom is something that you have to work on. It's not something that you can buy at a store. You don't wake up one day and simply become wise. It takes effort, it takes time, it takes learning. But as Solomon says in Proverbs, wisdom is more precious than ruby, more precious than gold. When Lady Wisdom is calling for you, chase after her, seek after her. It's almost like he's getting to Proverbs as he's speaking about Ecclesiastes. Even with this push for wisdom, he has somewhat of these contradictory warnings. So he'll say something like, the words of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected saying. They are given by one shepherd. My son, beware of anything beyond these. Of making many books, there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. Also goes on to say, the wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I perceive that the same event happens to all of them. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart, this also is vanity. Some things here. He's saying, look, if the fool is going to die the same way that I'm going to die, why am I spending all this time learning and becoming wise? And he says, much study is a weariness of the flesh. Many books, because there are many books and there's no ending to them. So you can always continually go on learning and learning. And he says, this is all vanity. These are all things that are going to disappear because you're going to die. And sometimes it comes across as if Solomon is actually afraid of death, because everything to him is vanity, because death is the great equalizer. And he doesn't seem to like the fact that death is the great equalizer. Perhaps it's his pride, perhaps it's something else, but it does seem to me that when you're reading this, even after he said that wisdom is important, he goes on to say these things like, my son, beware of anything beyond these, right? Beyond the collected wisdom. Of making many books, there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. Or, what happens to the fool happens to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? This is all vanity. But having just done Confucius, there is a very good reason why we study the minds of the wisest humans. It is because you want to get to a point where what your heart and your mind desires are aligned with what is good. And so to quote Confucius, from 15, my heart and mind was set upon learning. From 30, I took my stance. From 40, I was no longer doubtful. From 50, I realized the propensities of shun. From 60, my ear was attuned. From 70, I could give my heart and mind free rein without overstepping the boundaries. I expound on this in the previous episode with Confucius around how your whole life is geared and working towards this point where there is no tension, there is no conflict, there is no misalignment between what you value and what is good, what is naturally good. Because what your mind values and what your heart desires are the things that are actually beautiful, the things that are actually true. And the interesting thing is Solomon never actually gets to that point. He rather ends the whole book with, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. He doesn't really explain why you should fear God, why you should keep his commandments. But in one sense, it is similar to what Confucius says, insofar as the commandments are taught to be something that is from God, something that's supposed to teach you the way of living a life worthy and the way of living a life that's holy. And Solomon talks about time. And there's a beautiful poem on chapter 3, and the poem goes like this. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under the heaven. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. The funny thing about life is nothing is the same and everything is the same. We have repeating seasons, winter, spring, summer, fall. It goes in a cycle over and over again, but each year is not a repetition of the previous year. It's a totally different year, totally different experience. And Solomon here is saying everything has its time. There's a time to be born and a time to die. A time to sow and a time to tear. A time to seek and a time to lose. And you likely have experienced this where you've had friends who have gone on, friendships that you've lost, lovers that you've lost. There have been times when you've wept, but there's also been time when you've been filled with laughter. That poem captures humanity and the experience of humanity in 8 verses. In all of this, as I mentioned, there's this looming question about death. He says, all is vanity. All is chasing after the wind because everybody's going to die. And with death, there's nothing you can take with you. You are born naked, you will die naked. And you are born with nothing, you will die with nothing. No matter how much it is that you have, no matter how much things that you've achieved in this life, no matter how many medals you have, no matter how large your business is, no matter whether you are praised as the greatest politician of all time, you will not be able to take any of this to your death. And that's why he says, no man has power to retain the spirit or power over the day of death. Meaning you cannot, by any sense of the word, have power over when you will die. Like nobody knows when they're going to die. We have now tried to bring the question of your impending death into the hands of doctors through euthanasia, and so that you can time when you die. But that's an assisted death. That's not a natural death we're talking about. And so precisely because you cannot know when you're going to die, Solomon writes, in the morning sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. Whatever it is that you do, do your utmost, because you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You don't know whether it's going to succeed. You have to take the risk. You have to be willing to trust the process of learning a new skill, starting a new business, whatever it is. Sow your seed in the morning, and even in the evening, do not withhold your hand. Continue to do it, even if you do not see the results tomorrow or the day after. For in that process of doing that work, you are building your character. And it reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from Confucius. If at dawn you learn of and tread the way, you can face death at dusk. If you haven't listened to that episode of Confucius, listen to it where I expound on this more. But it is similar to what Solomon here is saying, where for Confucius, he's saying, if in the morning you learn of and you're walking in the way, in the Tao, then when the nightfall comes, when death approaches you, you can face death because you have walked the way your whole life. you have walked the way from morning till dusk. Because in walking the way, you prepare yourself for death. And Solomon says, for man does not know his time, like fish that are taken in an evil net, and like birds that are caught in a snare. So the children of man are snared at an evil time when it suddenly falls upon them. You can understand why I say that Solomon does not seem to be ready for death, because he sees it as this evil thing that's happening that he cannot be prepared for. Because he says, when it suddenly falls upon them, it's like an evil net. But Confucius seems to be the opposite. He doesn't see death as an evil. He doesn't see death as this thing that you should be fearful of. Because if you have walked away daily, then what is there to be afraid of when you die? And really, is death going to be any different than you falling asleep? You're not afraid of going to sleep. Why then are you afraid of dying? Solomon says this thing that I think is a very good reminder for us. For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing, and they have no more reward. For the memory of them is forgotten. Their love and their hate and their envy have already perished, and forever they have no more share in all that is done under the sun. Everybody that you know, your friends, your families, your parents, your children, once you die and once they die, nobody is going to remember your name. Very, very unlikely. Very few names are passed on from century to century. Many people know of the name John D. Rockefeller, but how many people know some of his colleagues, some of the other businessmen at his time? How many people know the 22nd president of the United States? His name is Grover Cleveland, by the way. But how many people know of him? Not many. And he was the president of the United States. Everything that you know of, everything that you've done, all the people that you love, all the people that hate you, they will all perish. And this is actually a comforting thought. And it should be at least a comforting and motivating maxim, because that means that you should not care about what people think about you. And you should not spend your time giving your mind over to people and allowing them to control what you think, what you do. Live your life with wisdom and do the things that you love, and make sure all the things that you do, obviously, are not immoral, and make sure you walk in the way, as Confucius says. And Solomon writes, in my vain life I have seen everything. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs in his life in his evil doing. Another one of these paradoxes where he says the righteous man, even though he's righteous, he perishes, but the wicked man, even though he's wicked, he prolongs his life. And so then, should we be like the wicked man? And Solomon's answer is no, you shouldn't. You should spend your time gaining wisdom, enjoying the fruits of your labor, and enjoying the time that God has given you. And that's why he writes, go eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. And I want to end with this last verse. Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun the very few days of his life that God has given him, for this is his lot. You have a certain amount of time on this earth. Whether there's the afterlife or not is beside the point, but the fact is there is only a certain amount of time here, and the thing that Solomon is trying to teach here is that you should enjoy every moment of your time here. Enjoy your work, enjoy your family, enjoy your friends. Drink your wine with a merry heart. I think that's actually quite a good statement here when he says merry heart. He doesn't say drink wine with an angry heart, drink wine with a gluttonous mind. He says drink wine with a merry heart. You are only merry and your heart is only filled with joy and peace when you are around those that you love and when you are doing things that you love. Because at the end of it all, everybody that you love, everybody that hates you, all the envy in the world, anything that you have that you've gained, they're all going to perish. Nothing is going to survive death. So why then are you afraid of dying? Why not start living today? That is the challenge for today. And with that, I wrap. Thank you for listening to this episode. I appreciate you. If you haven't already subscribed, do subscribe and share this episode with your friend if you've taken something away from it. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. It's at ij@becomingantifragile.com. You can follow me on Instagram. That's probably where I'm most active. And if you haven't already, go to my Substack and subscribe. Each week I write an article around the episodes that I've done or around something that I'm thinking about. Until next week, peace.